these tests are not really good science. Also, the idea that they overly put you into a box, a category. Personality is a lot more complex than that. You can't just get a single score and assume you're always that person. Actually, in different situations, you're going to reflect different personas. Every role or situation you're in is going to kind of call forth a different version of you to some degree. And so these tests, they emphasize content, but they ignore context.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have on the show Dr. Benjamin Hardy. Dr. Benjamin Hardy is an organizational psychologist and best-selling author of Willpower Doesn't Work. His blogs have been read by over 100 million people and are featured on Forbes, Fortune, CNBC, Big Think, and many, many more. He is a regular contributor to Inc. and Psychology Today, and from 2015 to 2018, he was the #1 writer in the world on Medium.com. His latest book, Personality Isn't Permanent, debunks the pervasive myths of personality, as well as tests like Myers Briggs. It's my great pleasure to have Benjamin on the show today. So welcome, Benjamin.
James, it's just good to be with you.
So nice to have you back. So what's happening in your world just now?
Well, we have 5 kids. Not sure how many we had last time I chatted with you, but we adopted our 3 foster kids. We now have twins. My wife is pregnant with a 6th, which is a little crazy. That'll be our last for sure. And just kind of trying to live and thrive during COVID. You know, I have a separate office, which, you know, it's a house about 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from my house that I bought for like writing and doing stuff like this. So it's nice for me to leave. I leave early and do my writing and stuff like this. Go home about 2 or 3 and just really enjoy the family. And yeah, and we're doing really great. I think this has really brought us together as a family. It's helped me to, as it's done for many people, helped me to further focus on those things which truly matter, and you know, just really enjoying life.
So that's very fortunate to have somewhere that's separate from your home that you can just walk out.
It was a good investment. Yeah, my wife and I were talking about how we're glad that I did that about 6 months ago. Obviously, with no anticipation that COVID would occur.
And so that gives you that little space that you can kind of go there, focus, do that work, and come back and spend more time with the family. Now, the last time you came on, we were talking about Willpower Doesn't Work, which is a great book. Your new book is called Personality Isn't Permanent, which is a fascinating area. So first of all, tell us where the initial idea for the book came about.
I mean, I had heard a few quotes, and obviously I spend a lot of time thinking about change. So I had, you know, there's a quote, I think it's an apocryphal quote from Albert Einstein. He said that the measure of intelligence is the ability to change. There's a quote from Alain de Botton, the British philosopher. He says, if you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough. So, I mean, there were these quotes and these ideas that I was really loving. And I was trying to think of the next book I would write after Willpower. And I read a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Not sure if you've heard of that one, James.
No, I haven't heard that one.
It's a pretty intense book. It's thick, it's huge, it's pretty academic. It's about trauma and all the science and research on trauma. And it's written by a guy named Bessel van der Kolk. And anyways, one of the things that he talks about in that book is that trauma, you know, just negative emotional experiences of some sort, trauma freezes your personality. It keeps you stuck in the past. It leads you to being emotionally rigid. It shatters your hope in the future. It shatters your imagination. It shatters your flexibility. So trauma, if it's unresolved, really can keep you stuck. And the idea of the frozen personality was really interesting to me. The idea that your personality stopped developing and changing and developing. And I had obviously studied psychology for a long time, but I felt like that book triggered me to say, I think I need to write a book about why why people have incorrect views of personality. Like a lot of people think that personality is innate, that it's non-changeable, that it's something you have to discover, that it's your true and authentic self. Like people have weird notions about personality, but usually they're kind of a fixed mindset. And so in hearing about trauma and about how trauma is one of the key things that keeps your personality rigid and kind of stuck in the past, I just thought, okay, I think I need to write a book on this subject about why personality gets stuck and ultimately what are the things that can be transformed so that you can become who you want to be. And so that's kind of what led me down that rabbit hole.
Now, at the start of the book, you tell a story, I think it's about your wife and her family. You would go to school, you'd take a test, and were you a red person or a yellow person? And we've all probably had those tests done maybe at school where you were put into different things, or a Myers Briggs or Strength Finders, or there's lots of different ones as well, where we're kind of given a code. We're told, this is you are this.
Yeah, a label or a type.
Yeah, so we're labeled with this as well. And in preparation for coming onto this interview today, I thought, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at some of my original diaries when I was about 14, when I think I remember first doing one of those types of tests and having a look at it. And I was laughing about how different what that test supposedly said and the kind of work I should do from what I actually do today as well. But that's just like one person's experience of that. So what did you find out when you kind of looked into the science and whether these, because a lot of it's based upon, I know Myers Briggs, a lot of it's based upon Jung and some of his, his kind of psychology as well. What did you find when you kind of looked into science of these personality tests?
Yeah, I love your story. I think it's amazing that you actually still have those documents. I wish I still had mine. It'd be funny to see what those tests would have said, that what careers I should have gone on.
There was lots of school reports saying must try harder. I remember that as well.
I will say I have nothing against Carl Jung. I think that a test like Myers and Briggs is just an interpretation of his work. It's not actually a reflection of his work. And I think a lot of when I say that tests like Myers and Briggs are non-scientific, people then try to defend Carl Jung. And I say Carl Jung had nothing to do with Myers Briggs. These are two people who liked his work and created some tool as an interpretation of it. Yeah, so it was really interesting to me when I was doing my PhD and I did mine in organizational psychology. There was a big aspect of our work where we developed tests, and in order to do science, you've got to create tests to measure things. And I was always surprised that all my professors would talk about how tests like Myers and Briggs are not really good science. They're poorly designed tests. In order for something to be good science, it's got to be valid and it's got to be reliable. You've got to actually be studying what you claim to be studying. Your test actually has to be getting the information and creating the information that it says it does. In the case of personality, the test actually has to be studying personality. And then it's got to reliably reliably give you that score. If you don't get the same score consistently, then it's not that reliable of a scale. It'd be like stepping on a scale for your weight and getting totally different scores every time you step on it. These tests are not really good science. Also, the idea that they overly put you into a box, a category. Personality is a lot more complex than that. You can't just get a single score and assume you're always that person. Actually, in different situations, you're going to reflect different personas. Every role or situation you're in is going to kind of call forth a different version of you to some degree. And so these tests, they emphasize content, but they ignore context. And obviously, I'll give just a couple reasons why these tests you should be wary of these tests. First off, just kind of the scientific nature of them. There's a lot of research that talks about how the conditions in which you take the test determine the score you get. So there was one study where they took two groups of people, and one of the groups, they took the same personality test, and they took it once and then they took it about a week later. And that group had the same test administrator. The same person gave them the test. In that group, they had pretty similar scores. It was only a week interval, a week long. The second group had the same situation. They took the same test. About a week later, they took the same test. The only difference was that it was a different test administrator both times. And by just changing that one factor, that one variable, the scores of people's test scores were completely non-correlated. Like, people answered the tests totally different a week later just because someone else was giving them the test. There's a lot of other examples of this, but the main things I'm concerned about are the psychological things that happen to people. So Ellen Langer, she has been studying mindfulness for about 40 years at Harvard. Totally recommend her book, Mindfulness and Counterclockwise. They're mind-blowing. But she studies what leads people to being mindless, meaning you're not being aware of the situation or yourself. And having a label is one of the things that leads you to being very mindless. So like, if you think you're depressed, as an example, you'll think you're always depressed, even though that's not actually true. In many situations, you're actually feeling good, but you don't pay heed to those situations. It's like when you buy a car, you see that car everywhere. You know, on the road, you can see the same car you're driving, but you don't see the hundreds of other cars. So you can, when you have a label, you think it's always true, but it's not always true. But it also leads you to trying to confirm your identity. You set goals and you try to confirm your current identity, and you overly define your current self. And where the research has gone now is that it's really actually healthy to consider your current self as a different person than your future self. Your future self is going to be a different person, just like who you are 5 years ago is probably different than who you are today. It's better for decision making to say, my future self is not the same person I am today. They're going to be quite different. And that way you can hold your current identity a little looser rather than overly defining your current self.
That's interesting. I just read something this morning as from a friend of mine he's a quite well-known professional public speaker in Asia. And he was just talking about, on the outside, so many people see him as this very extrovert, up on there on stages, kind of motivating thousands of people at a time. And in the city in which he lives, they've just had like 4 weeks of lockdown, and I think they've just been told they're going to have like another 4 weeks. And he said he's actually quite excited about having another 4 weeks of lockdown. He said because he's discovering from this that he's actually, we talk about the extrovert introvert thing. He said the person that he's always been painted as, and the person that he even often he thought of himself as, is maybe not the whole of him. That kind of introvert extrovert. I know that's something that a lot of authors can struggle with sometimes, because for example, you're going out, you're on the road, you're not physically on the road, but going out doing interviews and things like that, more extrovert, having to be out there. But often we think of the role of the author as being quite a introverted one as well. So
yeah.
So what's your take on that?
I think that personality is complex. I think that you shouldn't overly define yourself one way or another. I think that that's a really big, that would hinder you from being flexible outside of the label you give yourself. So if you call yourself an introvert, that's a pretty definitive explanation. First off, it's not always true, because in certain situations, you're actually probably quite social, but also what's more important is defining the person you want to be, who your future self is. And that's more important than overly defining your current self. When you've defined yourself so much one way, you become inflexible to anything outside of that label. So if you're like, I'm an introvert, then you feel like being an extrovert or acting socially is out of your identity. It's out of your character. And I don't think you need to think that way about yourself. Yeah, you may be more comfortable doing some things, but kind of where I go with this book and kind of explaining it is that the goal should shape who you are and what you do. Just like the goal shapes the process. If you have a goal, that shapes your process. Well, your goal should ultimately also shape your personality. It shapes what you're willing to do. So for myself, because I have the goal, and I, by the way, I may have already said this, but personality really could be redescribed as comfort zone. It's what you're comfortable doing. To do anything outside of your comfort zone is to do something outside of your typical way of doing things. So it'd be outside of your typical personality. But outside of your comfort zone is usually where your goals are. So in order to achieve goals, you kind of have to stop being who you've been in the past. And so for myself, rather than saying I'm one way or another, it's more like, what does my goal require me to do? My goal, if I'm serious about my goal, which I've proactively chosen, which in my case is to sell millions of books, then I better get good at talking to people. I better get comfortable in those situations. And what we call that is psychological flexibility. Rather than overly defining yourself and being rigid outside of your comfort zone, you define who you want to be, and you become increasingly flexible, psychologically flexible in new situations, so that you can ultimately adapt and become someone new with new skills and abilities. And so, yeah, I think that rather than overly defining yourself and setting goals that cater to your comfort zone, you set goals that you genuinely want, and then you become someone who can achieve those goals.
And on that, I'm just wondering, as you were kind of researching this book about personality, uh, when you started coming across things like identity, which feel kind of related in some ways, or not,
Identity is
again.
very close, and I think that, in my opinion, identity is far more important than personality.
So something like, someone says, I am this, and they feel very strongly about this. I remember seeing something a while back which said, everyone that's a student is kind of left wing, and as they get older, they go more to the right. Their identity kind of changes over time. I'm talking about political identity here, not just as one form of identity. So what did you find about that kind of relationship with, because that personality and identity, because we feel like we're definitely living in a time of identity politics, the way that things are projected, tribes, very, very strong in our culture just now.
Yeah. I mean, I actually deep dive. All of chapter 2 is on identity in this book. And identity is so crucial because identity is kind of the byproduct of your goals. Whatever it is you're seeking or going after, that's where your identity is. And so it forces you to question what you're going for, what you're trying to accomplish, or what you're trying to do. And so, yeah, so basically, here's how I kind of describe it: is your goal shapes your identity. Your goal is whatever you're trying to accomplish. You're doing a podcast and stuff like that. And so that's a big aspect of your identity. You obviously have other things you're trying to do. And so those things shape your identity, and your identity shapes your behavior and your situations. And over time, those things become your personality. So your identity, if consciously constructed, should be the thing driving your personality. And your identity can and should be based on what you're trying to do or accomplish or be, your future self. So many people's identity, their narrative and their story is based on their past, and they have a very definitive way of explaining themselves. And so as a result, their identity is kind of leading them to stay who they already are, because they're explaining themselves in present terms and in pretty concrete terms. I am X, and so then their personality continues to reflect their identity story. It's a lot more. Identity is something that can be quite flexible, though. It's something that we all go through identity shifts over time, and it's something that we could and should be the ones who are directing the way we explain ourselves. There's a whole theory called the theory of narrative identity, and it's all about how your identity is shaped through the stories you tell about yourself. And
that reminds me, there was a book I was just reading, the James Clear book recently, the Atomic Habits book, and he said, one of the biggest differences you can make on whether something becomes a habit is really whether you change your identity to say, I am a runner, I am a kind of, I'm trying to think of something, I'm an author.
No, I think James
embody
is,
that. You kind of embody that.
Yeah, I think James is hitting the nail on the head on that one. He and I have disagreements in many ways, because he kind of downplays the importance of goals, even though he is a goal-driven person. But your identity, kind of going back to that idea of I am a runner, you would only shape that narrative if you saw value in running. You want to be a runner for some reason or another, whether it's because it feels good or because it leads you to being healthy, or whether you enjoy it. And so you want to start by defining kind of the identity that you want to have. Obviously, that should be attached to a goal or a why, but you want to start with your future identity and explain yourself. And then that's the story you now tell. So defining your future self is a really powerful thing to do.
So when you kind of going into this book, did you really want to write a book on personality, or was it really more on change?
I think that they're very connected concepts. I explain why personality gets stuck. It's the book is about both. The book is about how to change who you are and not be defined by the past. And so personality for many people is a repetition of who they've been in the past for quite a while. And it's usually one of the main explanations as to why people are the way they are. And so I wanted to kind of prove through the science and through the research and also through common sense and stories that personality actually doesn't matter that much. It's a byproduct, and it's something that you can kind of direct. And I agree with James and with what you're saying, that identity is the place to start. But the real place to start is not the identity of who you are today. It's actually the identity of your future self. Like
And
there's a
do
lot
you
of, yeah, go
and do you
ahead.
remember in your own kind of life, your own kind of journey, was there a key moment when you felt that flexibility, that plasticity of your of what you thought personality and identity was, and you were like, oh, actually maybe it doesn't have to be this way? Was there a key moment in your
There's a
life?
lot of key moments. I mean, once you start to see it, you stop holding your current identity so tightly, you can create them at will. You know what I mean? I'm doing it today. You know, I'm striving to be my future self today. But yeah, there was definitely a big moment when that flexibility started to occur, so that and really that flexibility and that confidence and flexibility are similar ideas. But yeah, when I decided to serve a church mission, and I changed my environment. I had a new role. I had a new purpose, and I realized how fast I could change. You know, I wasn't as confined by my peer group or by the roles that I had been in the past, or even by my traumas or just the situation. I mean, it was like a flip switched, and all of a sudden I could be a lot different, and I could act from the new role or the new persona. And you know, I went from being someone who was playing video games all day to someone who was a very committed missionary. And I ultimately became a leader and became someone who, you know, and think about it, like when you start doing something, you can start to define yourself. Like I remember when I was starting to read and I was really enjoying it, then I started to think, well, I want to be someone who reads a lot, and I want to be someone who's really educated and knowledgeable. This is me defining my future self. And so I started to think in those terms, and then I watched myself do it, and I watched myself become that style of a missionary or a leader. You know, I want to become a better leader and help people more, and just then going through the process of becoming that, and not holding so tight and attaching to, you know, I've never really been a leader in the past. Like, yeah. So on my mission, I had a lot of opportunities in that context to flex my identity in different ways and to proactively watch myself become, you know, who I wanted to be in different ways. And then obviously going through college and choosing to, you know, really dive into psychology and watching myself do that. Now watching myself dive into being a father or an entrepreneur or a collaborator. And you can get better and better at directing the ship of where you become as a person.
You spoke earlier about this idea that goals should shape your process. Goals can really can shape
Identity.
your identity, your personality as well. Going through what we've been going through just now in this kind of COVID-19 coronavirus world, is there something that you've been learning in this process? You say, actually, this is useful for me. This is something I've learned in the present now that I actually want to take into that future, and it supports that goal in the future as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, I actually break down how goals are developed. You know, your goals are developed by what you're exposed to. You know, they're developed by what you currently desire, and they're developed by what your confidence. You know, if you had more confidence, then you'd probably set a different goal. And if you were exposed to different things, then you'd probably set a different goal. You know, you can't proactively choose something you're not aware of. So yeah, I think new experiences can definitely shift your goals, because then you become aware of something you hadn't been aware of before. Or, you know, so yeah, I think for a lot of people, COVID-19 obviously reshapes their goal. It can reshape their future self. Um, didn't really do that for me, because my, you know, it may have enhanced my goal. For sure it actually did. Because I had more time and focus, for example, to do stuff like this, that I was able to expand my goal. Um, so yeah, I think new experiences definitely can and should reshape our focus. And I think that we want to, and I actually encourage it in the book, is to continue to expose yourself to more and more things, you know, better things as well, reading good books so that you can actually set better goals. Because just because you have a goal doesn't mean it's a useful, you know, a worthwhile goal. You could set a better goal, you know, because whatever it is that is your goal, that's what's shaping your identity and your behavior. So I think we should be weary of our current goals potentially, and question if they're worth our time, you know, and constantly be exposing ourselves to better things so that we can pursue better things in the future. This kind of lends to the idea that your future self is someone different than you are today anyways, because they're in a different context, a different situation. They've been exposed to new things. They've gone through experiences you don't have. hopefully they can set more mature and better goals than you are right now. Therefore, hopefully they can have a better identity and priority and perspective and personality than you currently have.
And that could be a topic for an entirely new, different podcast episode as well. In fact, when I mentioned I found all those old information before, go back to age 14 of finding supposedly what my personality type was. The other thing I found was some of those goals I set back there as well. And I definitely think
it's interesting, isn't it?
It's a different perspective that you have when you're a little bit older and you've gone through some things. And maybe that wasn't the smartest goal to have. Maybe at that point it was, but maybe it wasn't the best goal in the future.
Well, I mean, it was the best goal you could set at the time.
Exactly.
And just like right now, the thing that you've set is the best goal you could potentially set at the time. I mean, you may be able to question it in a journal and say, is this really the best goal I should be setting? And I would actually encourage that. But hopefully in the future, you know things that you don't know right now. Therefore, maybe you shouldn't hold so tight to your current perspective. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. Hopefully the future version of you sees things a little better so that you can, just like you looking back. I mean, I think that's a beautiful experience. I actually love doing this. In my journals, in the front cover, I write down my current goals in every one of my journals. And I can go back 3 or 4 years ago and think, wow, it's interesting that that's what I was pursuing. Like that was my confidence level. Or wow, like I've really, it's fun to look at old goals because those goals are your identity. Those are the things you're striving for and are believing in. And so it's really great to look back and to see that shift process.
Well, Benjamin, it's been a pleasure having you again on the show here. We'll also put a link here if you want to go and listen to the very first episode that you came on as well. And we'll have so people can kind of check out that as well. That's a more kind of traditional format of this show. Some of the other things that we covered there. Your new book, Personality Isn't Permanent, will be out by the time this episode comes out. So please go and get your copy of that as well. And Benjamin, thank you so much. Please stay safe, stay well, and wish you all the best to your family as well. Thanks so much for coming on The Creative Life.
It was such a pleasure. You have a great day.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.